Now we quickly move on to Dr. Silke. So Dr. Silke is going to help us understand the scientific jargons. For those of us in the room who are wondering, what are some of these highly hazardous pesticides? Dr. Silke is our go-to person, and she will provide us with an overview of the Highly Hazardous Pesticides report. Dr. Silke Bollmohr holds a PhD in environmental science and ecotoxicology from the University of Cape Town and the University of Landau in Germany. Over the past 2 decades, she has dedicated her work to studying the impacts of pesticides on biodiversity and human health in several African nations and in Germany. Her extensive experience in risk assessment and risk communication spans across academic research, private industry, government roles, and non-governmental organizations. Currently, Dr. Silke serves as the lead scientist at EcoTrack Consultancy and acts also as a policy advisor for global agriculture at the German NGO Inkota Network. Dr. Silke is also the lead author of this report. When I sought her understanding of the phrase, "Let food be thy medicine, and thy medicine food," she delightfully said, "This quote highlights the inseparable connection between the food we eat and our physical well-being, advocating for a holistic approach to health that recognizes the healing potential of the foods we eat." A round of applause for Dr. Silke, please.
All right. Yeah, Claire, thank you very much for the nice introduction. Thank you to Heinrich Böll Foundation to get me here, and thanks to the whole team of Root to Food and Heinrich Böll Foundation. I think it has been a long journey together, and I believe this is one of the highlights. And thanks to all of you showing interest in this report and the data I will present and some of the facts. I can't talk about all of the facts, but I just want to highlight some of them, and you can read the rest in the report. Okay, so just to put you a little bit into the context, you can see on the right-hand side the figure showing the global use of pesticides. And you can see on the African continent in the blue bubbles, the use is still quite low compared to other continents. However, the increase, which you can see in the black boxes on the African continent, is quite high. So the 33 million smallholder farmers in Africa are definitely a potential growing market for pesticide companies, especially when you look at the fact that the pesticide use in Europe, for example, almost decreased a little bit. So there's more consciousness, more awareness, and Europe has a big agenda in terms of reducing the pesticide use. Many of the companies coming from Europe, and that is definitely a sort of growing market, the African continent, for them, because they can't sell the pesticides so much in Europe anymore, but also in North America, etc. On the left-hand side, you can see a figure which we got from the Agrochemical Association of Kenya, and that also shows a clear increase of pesticide imports. It almost doubled from 2015 to 2018. So pesticide use, pesticide import is definitely increasing, as you can see here. I just want to very briefly tell you how we identified the highly hazardous pesticides. I think that's quite important to understand, because many governments and also pesticide industries relate to the criteria by the WHO and the Global Harmonized System. These are very well-defined criteria, which you can see here, the criteria 1 to 7. It states, for example, pesticide formulations which are clearly classified as highly toxic or acute toxic to humans, which are under the WHO 1A and 1B pesticides, and they are not at all allowed in Europe anymore. But then you've also got the criteria on carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, etc. And pesticides which are under the Stockholm Convention, the Rotterdam and the Montreal Convention, they are all defined as highly hazardous pesticides by the WHO. However, only 4% of the pesticides being in use globally are covered by these international conventions. So this is not a lot. And many highly hazardous pesticides are being used by farmers all over the world and are not regulated internationally yet. There is the 8th criteria for classifying highly hazardous pesticides says under local application conditions, they can cause severe or irreversible harm to health or the environment. And I think this is very critical for countries like Kenya, where many farmers not wearing protection equipment, where they're not, or they even can't oblige to mitigation measures which are normally imposed on the pesticide use. And the Pesticide Action Network International came up with a list of highly hazardous pesticides, which are based on these clear criteria 1 to 7 from the WHO, plus looking at further environmental toxicity, because that is not covered in the 7 criteria, and also other human health toxicity criteria. So that's why we decided to not use the criteria of the WHO, but using the PAN, which is including more pesticides than the WHO. Apart from that, there is no official list yet. So this is the only option we can basically use. I think Haroon mentioned it already. I just want to briefly lead you to why we were actually needing to buy data on really getting a good picture on the pesticide use in Kenya. The first report we did was saying that we looked at registered pesticides in Kenya. So all the pesticides being registered by PCPB and classified them on HHPs or banned. And you saw or you heard already the results. Almost half of them were HHPs, and half of those HHPs are banned in Europe. But the criticism about the study was, but we don't know if they're used by farmers. So they're just registered. Maybe they're sitting somewhere on the shelf and no one is using them. That's why we did a study with Cohen together and looked at farmers in Murang'a and Kirinyaga and did questionnaires with them. And there we found more or less the same picture. 74% of all households in Murang'a and Kirinyaga used highly hazardous pesticides. Many of them showed chronic health effects, and only 30% of the households mentioned that they're using the full protection equipment. So that was basically supporting the results out of the first report. But then again, there was criticism about this report saying, yeah, but these are only just 2 counties, so we don't know the whole situation in Kenya. And that's why we bought data from a market research company called GfK Kynetec. They obtained these data by questionnaires from trade associations, industry, farmers, etc. And this market research company is based in the US. And the data coming out of that research company, out of the database, for example, is so reliable that the US is using it for coming up with water quality monitoring programs. So these are highly reliable data based on questionnaires with different stakeholders within Kenya. So they do crop-to-crop, country-to-country market research, and that's where we got the data from. And we got data on the volume of products, the volume of active ingredients, the area, which is, or the cover, which is sort of sprayed by pesticides. We also got information on the type of crops, so we know now which pesticides has been used on which crops. We also know about the costs of the products, and I think that's also quite interesting, how much farmers in Kenya are actually paying for these pesticides and for the pest management in Kenya. And we know the brand owners of the products. These are the brand owners. Very important to also highlight, and I'm sure this question will come up, these are used data, these are not imported data. So we don't know where the pesticides are coming from which country. We just know which company is the brand owner. Yeah? And at the bottom you can just see an example of the Excel sheet with the different results. Now, Joachim mentioned already all these numbers. I think I don't need to repeat them. We found out 310 products. Very important point here is, out of these 310 products, pesticide products, only 6 products are biopesticides used to control insect pest, and only 1 product is a biopesticide which controls fungal diseases. So a very low percentage of the pesticides used by farmers are actually biopesticides, which would lead us to a more sustainable pest management strategy. Yeah, the number of active ingredients, 151, total volume of 3,000 tons. This is by far lower than the data from the AAK, which I showed you in the first slide, but these were the import data. Again, import data are different to use data because pesticides get into Kenya, but then Kenya is also exporting to Uganda, to Tanzania, etc. So the usage of the farmers, of the pesticides by farmers is lower than the imported ones. We've got 73 different brand owners of the products being used and a total cost of almost 73 million US dollar. 52% of the products has been used on weeds, so 52% are herbicides, 27% are fungicides, and 21% are insecticides, which is not surprising because herbicides normally being used in higher volumes. So these are volume data, so amount of pesticides being used by the farmers, and there's no surprise that the herbicides basically take up the highest volume amongst the total use. Okay, but now let's go to the important facts. When we look and categorized all the used pesticides, Joachim said already, we found out 76% of all the pesticides, the volume of all the pesticides, are highly hazardous pesticides, and 44% of them are banned in Europe. And together with the fact, and we got this figure on the right-hand side from the Agrochemical Association, together with the fact that farmers are not able to use protection equipment, as you can see here, only 15% out of their study using protection gear, and only 11% can explain the labels. This is quite worrying. But now let's dive a little bit deeper into the data. This slide shows you the top 30 products according to the volume, the amount of application. So basically, these products has been used in the highest amount in Kenya. And at the bottom, you can see the name of the different products. And most of these products are herbicides. And as I mentioned already, because herbicides need a higher application, but also herbicides are being used by almost every farmer being in this sort of research questionnaire. Now, if we look at the active ingredients of these herbicides, most of them contain glyphosate, which is under a big discussion worldwide, and also paraquat, which is already banned in 137 countries and still in use here. But also the fungicide Ridomil contains the fungicide mancozeb, and I will highlight this a little bit further on. Now, if we look at the area, like the land being sprayed by farmers in Kenya, we see a different picture. All of a sudden now, the very toxic insecticides come up, like Marshall, like Thunder, Belt, and Dursban. Marshall contains carbosulfan, is banned in many countries, and is used as a seed coating. So most of the area is being treated by this kind of insecticide. And it's highly toxic to bees, to birds, and especially birds, it's a problem because you can imagine if the seeds are coated with a carbosulfan lying on most of the areas in Kenya on the land, then birds will be impacted by that. Thunder is a product by Bayer, and Thunder contains beta-cyflothrin and imidacloprid. Both are banned and both are very toxic. Durspan, another very toxic insecticide, contains chlorpyrifos. These are all the ones which are treated in most of the areas, agricultural areas in Kenya. And although in low volumes, but because they are very highly toxic, it's a critical information you get here. Now let's get to the costs. How much do farmers actually pay for the active ingredients? And I'm sorry, the y-axis is a little bit small. I'm just gonna show you the most important things. The ones in red, the red bars, are all highly hazardous pesticides. So you can see there are hardly any gray ones. And the farmers using most of their money on glyphosate, on chlorpyrifos, and paraquat. These are the three top ones here down here at the bottom. Now, when we talk about costs, there was also one other thing which came up. We realized that the highly toxic pesticides like Marshall or Durspan are much cheaper than less toxic pesticides and are much, much cheaper than biopesticides. The biopesticide market is more or less focusing on HHP, which contains the active ingredient from the neem tree. So that one basically dominates by far the biopesticide market. And if you compare the costs in this figure, HHP in gray and all the other ones in red, you can see a clear difference in costs. Let's move to the crops now. So we looked at the different crops, and we just want to highlight the top 5, but we also have all the data for the other crops. So if you're interested, you can always contact us for the other crops. But what we found is that most of the pesticides are sprayed on maize, followed by wheat, followed by coffee, potatoes, and tomatoes. And again, the bars show you the percentage of highly hazardous pesticides in red and the non-highly hazardous pesticides in gray. And again, with most of the crops, you can hardly see the gray bar, so the highly hazardous pesticides definitely dominating the pest management. Now, I just want to show you 2 examples. You can see, you can have a look at all the other figures for the other crops in the report. But maize, for maize, we found out 83% of all the pesticides applied on maize in Kenya are highly hazardous pesticides, and 37 are banned in Europe. And by the way, it's not only Europe. We also have the data on, they're also banned in many other countries. So I'm just gonna state Europe as one continent, but as I said, paraquat is banned in many, many countries, and even Marshall is banned in many West African countries as well because of its toxicity. And you can see at the bottom, for maize, this is, by the way, this is the volume of pesticides, so the amount of pesticides, not the costs. So we move now from costs to amount. And so most of the active ingredients being applied on maize are 2,4-D, which is a herbicide. But then we also got glyphosate, atrazine, paraquat, chlorpyrifos. All those ones which are very toxic and banned in other countries. If we move to tomatoes, with tomatoes, 89% of the pesticides are highly hazardous, 79% are banned in Europe. And most of the pest management requires the fungicide mancozeb, which you can see here in this figure. And that one is banned in Europe and is also a highly hazardous pesticide. And the study together with Cohen also showed various highly hazardous pesticides on tomatoes from different markets in Kenya. So there is definitely an issue in the production of maize and tomatoes, but also wheat, potatoes, and coffee. Now let's look at the costs. How much do farmers pay for producing these different crops? And because they're using many of the pesticides for maize and wheat, obviously the costs for these crops are the highest. And just to highlight, $16 million are used on pest management for maize and for wheat production, and 7 million for coffee, potatoes, and tomatoes. And I think we should ask ourselves if this money can't be used in a more sustainable way of, for example, implementing integrated pest management or agroecological strategies for these type of crops. And these costs, which I'm mentioning right now, the 16 million and the 7 million for each crop, by the way, doesn't even include the hidden costs to the environment and to the human health. Let's briefly take a closer look to some of the products. I mentioned chlorpyrifos, which is contained in Dursban, but also in other products, but Dursban is the most used product in Kenya. That one has been used on coffee and maize. It's banned in 39 countries, and chlorpyrifos is very toxic to the neurodevelopment, to children, and it's very toxic to aquatic species and bees. Thunder, I mentioned already, contains the active ingredients beta-cefalothrin and imidacloprid. This one is mostly used on coffee and maize, again, banned in 29 countries, and beta-cefalothrin is a WHO 1B categorized highly hazardous pesticide. And it's extremely toxic to bees, fish, aquatic organisms, and imidacloprid, which is also banned in Europe because it's very toxic to bees. So these are the products which are mostly used by farmers here. And last but not least, I mentioned already Marshall, the seed coating, mostly seed coating for maize, but also used as spraying for coffee, beans, and rice. That one is banned in 48 countries, including Burkina Faso, Gambia, Niger, Senegal. And it shows a very high bird toxicity, but also bee toxicity. So now let's get to the corporate responsibility. Joachim mentioned already, we looked at the different brand owners and looked at the market share. And Syngenta is definitely the company with the highest market share with 20%, followed by Bayer with 15%. But then we've also got other international ones, Corteva, FMC, Adama, and UPL. And just to highlight Syngenta and Bayer, because they having the highest market share in Kenya, Syngenta sells all in all 40 different products in Kenya. 68% of them are highly hazardous, and their top selling products are herbicides like Touchdown, Forte, and Gramoxone. And I need to mention these data are from 2020, so they stopped exporting Gramoxone in 2021, according to what they said in interviews. But then also the fungicide Ridomil, which contains mancozeb. And let's move to Bayer. Bayer sells 39 products in total in Kenya. 84% are HHPs, and their top-selling product is Roundup Turbo, which contains glyphosate. But then in terms of money, the biggest value for them is the insecticide Thunder, which with the problematic beta-cefalothrin and imidacloprid. And these data are from 2020, as I mentioned, but the head of the sustainability section of Bayer mentioned just in September, just 2 weeks ago, that they assured that they took the product off their portfolio already since a long time. Any products which are in the category of 1A or 1B. And we can see this clearly is not the case. Now, I just want to get you back to the methods because the report also includes a list of pesticides which we suggest to be used by the registration body for prioritizing pesticides to be banned in Kenya. So what we did, we ranked the different pesticides out of the database we got from the market research company according to their toxicity towards the human health and towards the environmental health. And we didn't come up with this. This has been already used by many other different researchers around the world. So we just applied this kind of methodology, approved methodology, to our Kenyan data. And we categorized or scored the different pesticides according to their chronic health effects, like carcinogenicity, reproductive toxicity, etc. And as higher the toxicity, as higher the score. Or as more sure we are, as higher the score. And I'm sorry, this is now getting a little bit more complicated, but if you need to get more understanding, or if you don't really understand, you can always ask me either in the questions or later on during the get-together. But we basically looked at the different chronic health effects, and we looked at a certain database which has all this information. And the database, for example, says a carcinogenic effect for chlorpyrifos is possible. So that would mean for carcinogenicity and possible, this pesticide, chlorpyrifos, would get a score of 6. Yeah? So we just went through all the different chronic health effects. And the same for the environmental toxicity in terms of bee and aquatic. Now, the outcome, just based on the toxicity of the pesticides, is this one. For the human health, we've got a priority list, and for the environmental health, we got a priority list. So for the human health, just based on toxicity, we recommend bifenthrin, dichlorphos, carbendazim, diacinone, etc., to be phased out because they are highly toxic. They have the highest score in terms of their chronic health potential, and they're highly toxic to human health. And we did the same for the environment, and here we came up with chlorpyrifos, imidacloprid, etc. Now, but this is just the toxicity. We don't know how much is that being used by farmers in Kenya. So that's why we included the usage in the formula as well. And we came up with different pesticides. And this is much more relevant because these are highly toxic pesticides with a very high usage by farmers. And you can see the different active ingredients in the report. Okay, now let's get to the recommendations. First recommendation coming out of this report is definitely to phase out the highly hazardous pesticides gradually, according to the list I just showed you. And we welcoming very much the announcement of PCPB to withdraw certain active ingredients like pymetrocin, thiacloprid, diurone, chlorothalonil, propinep, and chlorpyrifos. But this is not enough. And I think the data out of this report showed clearly that we need to go further than that. And we suggest to prioritize based on the toxicity and the usage in the country, which are chlorpyrifos, which is already in the list by PCPB, which is very nice, imidacloprid, acetochlor, but also glyphosate, paraquat, atrazine, and mancozeb. But then we also need to look at the pesticides which are very, very toxic, but not being used in high volumes. And especially the insecticides come into play here. And these are bifenthrin, carbosulfan, beta-cefluthrin, dichlorphos, diacinone, etc. I think, or we think, and I think we all think, that the double standard should come to an end. And the Kenyan government should phase out those pesticides which are banned elsewhere, because they're banned for a good reason. They're not banned because the pesticides are not used there, which is very often the argument. They banned mostly because of unacceptable environmental and human health problems. And the Kenyan government should also pose an import ban on pesticides. Many countries did that already, like Mexico, Tunisia, to ensure the human right to safe, adequate food and the right to a healthy environment. I think the government should also advocate for the inclusion of more active ingredients in the lists, in the international lists of the Stockholm Convention, etc. I mentioned only 4% are covered by now. So countries like Kenya and governments should actually be actively involved in adding these pesticides, adding more pesticides to the list. And definitely agrochemical corporations must be held accountable for their business. They should not sell pesticides that are banned in the country of origin, and they should not sell them to countries with weaker regulations for profit-making purposes. And countries of origin, like for example Germany, should pose an export ban on pesticides that are banned in their own country. And as Joachim said already, we are still waiting for the approval of the cabinet in Germany on the announced pesticide export ban. And we also just released a press release in Germany that we're basically waiting now for a year on this. So you can see it's a problem. Another recommendation is to enhance data availability. We had to pay a lot of money for these data, but these data are crucial, as you can see, to make informed decisions about sustainable pest management. So these data should be available to everyone. And also monitoring is very important. No national monitoring is going on in terms of water, soil, food, accessible to all the citizens in Kenya. So this is a crucial thing. We need to address the true costs of the pesticides. I showed you the costs of the different active ingredients, but there are hidden costs as well. Farmers need to be empowered and be protected, and not only by providing them safety training on pesticide use, which is always being stated as a sort of mitigation measure. No, they need to be empowered and protected. They should receive training on real sustainable pest management solutions. And this is not only integrated pest management, that's also agroecology, looking at the whole system. And I think the export market is quite crucial for Kenya, so Kenya should sustain the export market. And that requires also to phase out some pesticides in this country. And this is now the last slide. I mentioned already the sustainable agricultural strategies, and I think that's very important because if farmers don't have alternatives, they need to use the highly hazardous pesticides. So we need to make sure that there is investment, research, and available information for every farmer on different solutions, on alternatives, and the alternatives are there. And these solutions will, you can see in the triangle, this is a typical integrated pest management triangle. You can see at the bottom, these are the basics, like the good soil health, biodiversity, etc. So this includes also agroecological methods. But if these methods are not working for a farmer and the pest is still a problem, then there are mechanical solutions. If this is not working, then we can use biological solutions or biopesticides. These are these ones. And here we need to increase the affordability and the availability of biopesticides in the country. You saw that the biopesticides are quite expensive compared to the very toxic ones. And then only as the last solution, synthetic pesticides should be used. But how is it done now with most of the farmers? Most of the farmers using first the synthetic pesticides over here at the bottom. So I think that needs to be changed, and there needs to be a lot of investment and information sharing, knowledge sharing, traditional knowledge sharing to come up with good alternatives and good solutions. So that's from my side, and thank you very much. I hope I didn't confuse you with the list, priority list and the calculations, and yeah, thank you.